Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a few days, but I haven't forgotten about you. It is about 6 minutes to 4 and on a Tuesday afternoon. And what I'm going to discuss is Neuro 11 and 12. I'm going to go over the difficult part of 11 and 12, and you're going to finish up a little bit of the last portion of 12 on your own as a self-study. I've mentioned it quite a few times in the past few hours of lecture and presentation, so it won't be difficult. 11 and 12 will be today. And I do want you, and I'll put this in an email too, I do want you to watch Spinal Cord and Spinal Nerves Part 1. Spinal Cord and Spinal Nerves Part 1 on YouTube. It's about 48 minutes, but it's extremely well done. And they're not working like I'm working right now. They're working out of a classroom with a proper studio, and the camera is set up, and then they can show the diagrams. So it's very, very good. And I previewed that, and I just love it. I think it's good. We have about 15 days to finish up. Now, I am not going to give you a quiz today, but next time when we go over lectures 13, maybe part of 14, I am going to give you a quiz over what I covered today. So the next time, expect the quiz, okay? And remember these quizzes, there's 10 questions to the quiz. It's a double quiz because we have 10 instead of 5. So this is a good way to make a good grade on your grade. Be sure and listen carefully. Read your textbooks. As a matter of fact, I want you to open up your textbook, because I did have you read, and you need to reread and underline and reread and take notes on some of this, not only on the lecture, but on what you're reading. Autonomic nervous system, page 428, 429, 430, 431, 32, 33, 433, 434, and 435, especially 434 and 435, because that diagram is magnificent. It explains beautifully in the diagram the sympathetic response that puts you in the fight or flight mode, and that is coming from your spinal cord, and the parasympathetic response that puts you in the relaxed mode, which is coming from the brain stem and then the sacral region. But those diagrams are wonderful, and pictures tell 1,000 words. So I do want you to read that. We will also read over to autonomic neurotransmitters. Okay. So it starts 428, and you're going to go to 436. And I will send that to you in the email also. So we've got a lot to cover. I want to remind you of something, and I want to make it really, really clear, because the very first time I studied this, it was a nightmare. And the very first time I studied it as an undergraduate student taking anatomy, I was totally confused about the ganglia issue. So I finished up that course still being shaky on the ganglia involved in the parasympathetic response and the sympathetic response. And then the ganglia, the dorsal root ganglia that we find in the reflex arc, and also when we feel something. So there were 3 sets of ganglia that gave me nightmares, and I don't want you to have a nightmare over it, please. So I'm going to try and explain that really, really well. Now I'm going to remind you of what you already know of the reflex arc. And if you remember correctly, a reflex is an autonomic response to a given stimulus. an autonomic response to a given stimulus. You do not have to think about it. You respond, you react. And after the reflex arc occurs, then you have ascending tracts that go up to the brain through the medulla, pons, the midbrain, thalamus, and the thalamus is the director, and the thalamus sends it to the right portion of the brain, the postcentral gyrus, the parietal lobe, and the frontal lobe, so that you have cognition of what just happened. But the reflex arc comes first. Now, I'm going to remind you of it, and this is in your textbook. I think I can see it more clearly this way. In the reflex arc, again, let's think about this. Remember, you have a receptor, and the receptor can be the skin. You walk into the kitchen, you accidentally put your hand on a hot skillet. The receptor picks up the pain, and the pain is, you're aware of it because the afferent sensory neuron goes all the way to the spinal cord. It goes into the dorsal root ganglion right here. And it's the dorsal root ganglion is sensory. Without that dorsal root ganglion, you wouldn't be able to sense anything. So it is extremely important. The impulse passes from the dorsal root ganglion, where that impulse is organized, and goes to the posterior or the dorsal root of the spinal cord. It then enters the dorsal horn right here, the dorsal horn, which in this transverse section, the dorsal horn is just a high concentration of cell bodies, except in the CNS, brain and spinal cord. Remember, we don't call it a ganglion if it's inside the brain and spinal cord. It's called a nuclei. So this group, or this nuclei in the dorsal horn, then relates it to the associate neuron or the interneuron, which connects sensory to motor, and then takes the message to the motor neuron in the ventral horn. The ventral horn is large because there are lots and lots of cell nuclei there, and it organizes that motor response and sends it out the motor neuron to the muscle, and you pull your arm away from the hot stove. So that is an autonomic response to a given stimulus. It wasn't premeditated. And I think we used that earlier in some of our presentations. We said a reflex is an unpremeditated response to a given stimulus. And after you pull your hand away from the burning stove, you've burned your hand, you're still getting pain, and it's still sending that message, but you've already pulled your hand away. So the message is sent, and then the impulse is sent from the gray matter to one of the ascending tracts in the white portion of the spinal cord. The ascending tracts are myelinated, and an ascending tract takes it all the way up the brain. It goes from the medulla to the pons to the midbrain, again to the thalamus, and then to the postcentral gyrus, where you become aware of what you just did and you feel that pain. You turn off the stove. But what's happened first was the reflex arc. Following the reflex arc was the knowledge of what just happened. And these reflexes are seen to work absolutely the best in teenagers, 15, 16, 17, early 20s. It's interesting because you think, oh, well, maybe a 50-year-old doesn't have the same ability. No, their reflexes are much slower in a 50-year-old, 60, 70, 80, they're much slower. But one thing that does happen, even though the reflex is much better in a young man or young woman, as they age, their depth perception is much, much better. So, what God giveth, he also taketh away. So, some things just do occur. But that's the reflex arc. Now, what I want you to know, and please don't forget this, the dorsal root ganglion is important in the reflex arc. The dorsal root ganglion is important in feeling everything you do. Your skin is a receptor. I'm picking up the mouse or touching the book or feeling the sensation of the top of the desk, which is solid and smooth and cool to the touch. That's because I'm getting the impulse from the receptor. It's not pain now, but from the receptor into the dorsal root ganglion. It takes it into the spinal cord where it goes up an ascending track. You're not getting the reflex arc because there's no pain or danger involved, but the dorsal root ganglion is still important for sensation. If this was destroyed, this dorsal root ganglion, then pain and the texture of the books, my sensation would be gone because it would destroy the sensation if the dorsal root ganglion was destroyed. So the backside of the spinal cord is sensory, the ventral side is motor. And I wanted to reiterate all of this because I don't want you to confuse the dorsal root ganglion with other ganglia involved in the sympathetic chain and in the parasympathetic chain. Okay. Now, if you look at your notes on page 27, in your notes, lecture 11, and if you look at your textbook on page 429. Now, that was in the 15th edition of Hull's Human Anatomy and Physiology. Look at that, page 429. Now, what you're looking at is the spinal cord. And remember, the spinal cord is an extension of the brain. It has all three meninges, the dura mater around the outside, the arachnoid, and then the pia mater. The pia mater is full of blood vessels that will protect, not only protect, but also feed nourishment, those blood vessels to the spinal cord. So you've got all three meninges. The outside of the cord also is bathed with cerebral spinal fluid, and running through the middle of the cord is the central canal. Now, if you just look at the cord itself, right here, if you just look at the cord itself, you're going to see that the cord, as it descends from the base of the brain to the second lumbar vertebra. So right about the second lumbar vertebra, sometimes they say in between L1 and L2, the end of the cord is met, and sometimes they'll just say at the end of L2 instead of between L1 and L2. But the end of the cord is cone-shaped. I think they refer to that as the conus medullaris. It's cone-shaped. And then from that cone shape, you have a number of cranial nerves that are hanging down loose. Now, all of this, of course, is contained within the dura mater and the arachnoid and the pia mater. It's all contained within those three meninges. But also note that the spinal cord changes its shape. It's real thick right up here in the cervical and brachial areas. Where it is thick, it has lots of nerves coming out. They call that the cervical plexus. And the area that the nerves emerge from the spinal cord to take care of movements of the arms is referred to as the brachial plexus. The word plexus means complex. You're just going to see a lot of nerves coming from the cord here and in the cervical region, because it has so much responsibility within the neck and the arms. Then you go on down, it thickens again in the lumbosacral area because it's accommodating all of that work that is carried on by the movement of your legs. So you see a cervical plexus, a brachial plexus, and a lumbosacral plexus right here. I wish he had illustrated it in a darker color than yellow, but you can see that. That's figure 11.31. Pictures say thousands of words. And that's discussed here. Now, if you look at the bottom, the autonomic nervous system, let's go back over the phylogenetic chart. Not the phylogenetic chart, but that's biology. We're talking about, if you look at the breakdown, the diagram of the nervous system. The nervous system is devoted or broken down into the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. And then the peripheral nervous system, which is broken down into all of those nerves. Everything outside the spinal cord is the peripheral nerves. And these peripheral nerves are broken down again into somatic nerves. When you hear the word somatic, you think of the body. And the somatic nerves are the controllable nerves. Those are the nerves that are coming off the spinal cord, and they go through a straight shot of motor neuron, motor neuron, motor neuron, motor neuron to the muscles. Somatic nerves are controllable. You make the decision to pick up the pencil, move your text, move the mouse. You're making that decision in the frontal lobe. Then that impulse is transferred to the precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. Remember that precentral gyrus affects gross and fine motor movements. So from the precentral gyrus, it passes through the basal nuclei, in which dopamine is released to regulate acetylcholine. It goes from there to the diencephalon, to the thalamus. The thalamus is the router. Remember, it sends everything to the right place except olfactory, which is just a straight shot to the brain. So the thalamus then sends it down the midbrain, pons medulla, down a descending track. And since I'm moving my arms down that descending white column of myelinated neurons, it sends it down, enters the gray portion of the spinal cord, the ventral horn, and sends it out the anterior portion of the spinal cord to motor neurons. So the motor neurons become motor, motor, motor to the muscles so that you can contract and move the skeletal bones of your arm. So somatic nerves descend in the myelinated tracts, exit the spinal cord by motor neurons, and motor, 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 motor to a straight shot to the muscles. No intervening ganglia. Now you think, what do you mean intervening ganglia? No intervening ganglia are involved in the decision to move, to make fine and gross motor movements. The decision is made with the brain, goes through the basal nuclei, down through the brain stem, down through the spinal cord, out the spinal cord by motor neurons to the muscles. Okay, so that is somatic. Those are controllable. And that's where that is mentioned right here in your notes. Controllable nerves are somatic. Straight shot to muscles. No intervening ganglia. Okay, just motor, 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 motor neuron to the muscles. Keep that in mind, and that's the reason I'm stressing it, because it was confusing to me the very first time I heard it. He probably explained it carefully, but my brain didn't comprehend it that way. So when I finally learned it correctly, I said, I'll never do that to a student. I'll really emphasize those somatic motor neurons, which you can control, is a straight shot to motor, motor, motor. Okay, those are the somatics. Now, the other portion of the peripheral nervous system that you don't control, you control the somatics. Those that you don't control, PNS, peripheral nervous system, peripheral nerves. In the peripheral nerves, you have the controllable ones or somatic, but you also have the autonomic. Autonomic nervous system. Autonomic means of a will to itself. You can take that word autonomic and turn it to automatic, and it's the automatic or autonomic nervous system that puts you in the fight or flight mode or in the relaxed mode. Now, that's when we take that breakdown from autonomics to parasympathetic and sympathetic. The parasympathetic, remember, puts you in the relaxed mode. These are nerves that put you in the relaxed mode. And you're going to find out pretty soon they come from the craniosacral region. The other nerves are the sympathetic nerves, and the sympathetic nerves put you in the fight or flight. Parasympathetic, relaxed. Sympathetic, fight or flight. Now, the beauty of these is parasympathetic and sympathetic have intervening ganglia. Lots of ganglia here. They're intervening. So you have the ganglia in the autonomic nervous system. In the somatic nervous system, those nerves that you control, you don't have these intervening ganglia, okay? And I'm not talking about the dorsal root ganglia. I'm talking about ganglia outside. When I first studied this, oh, woe was I thought that the dorsal root ganglion, oh yeah, that's the sympathetic chain. It not, okay. And so I missed it on the test. I don't want you to. All right, let's turn the page. Now, at the top of page 28, let me wet my whistle. Autonomic nervous system is a portion of the peripheral nervous system that functions autonomously and continuously. No thought processes are necessary for the functioning of this system. These nerves coming from the parasympathetic and the sympathetic branches, these autonomic nerves, they keep your heart beating. You don't have to think about it. They keep your food digesting in the process of digestion, in which the esophagus and stomach and small and large intestines release juices and they contract and expand and push food on. The breathing mechanisms, your respirations are autonomic. You can control them somatically, but thank goodness you don't have to autonomically when you're sleeping or you're not even thinking about it. Your diaphragm is arcing and relaxing, arcing and contracting, arcing and contracting. The arc is the relaxed, your intercostals. All of these things are going on autonomically. And the brain of the autonomic nervous system is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus. So think of everything that's happening automatically. The brain of that is part of the diencephalon. The floor of the thalamus is the hypothalamus. And that hypothalamus, if you remember correctly, had an endocrine function and a nervous function. And that function that's responsible for the nervous system is the autonomic nerves. That's where the brain comes from. That's the decision maker. Whereas in the autonomics, when you're deciding to clean up your office, boy, do I need to do that. Call someone on the phone, all of that, that is somatically decisioned. That is the frontal lobe. You're making a decision to do that. So that's directed by the cerebral cortex. You're thinking, whereas the hypothalamus controls everything autonomically. Okay. Now, you'll see in your notes that we state the somatic portion of the peripheral nervous system is controllable and made largely of motor neurons that are controllable. These neurons, these efferent autonomic motor neurons, are arranged differently than the somatic motor nerves. The somatic nerves are a straight shot from the spinal cord to the muscles, whereas the autonomic neurons that are in play, they have intervening ganglia. Again, do you know the difference between a ganglia and a nuclei? If a clump of cell bodies is in the brain and spinal cord, it is a nuclei, like the basal nuclei that release the dopamine in your brain that controls the acetylcholine, like the nuclei that are in the dorsal horn, the gray dorsal horn of a transverse section of the spinal cord, and also in the ventral horn of that transverse section of the spinal cord. Those clumps of cell bodies, they are nuclei. We call them ganglia in the PNS. In the CNS, they're nuclei. Okay. Now, as I said, somatics go straight to the muscles, no intervening ganglia. The autonomics do. Now, let's take it. Remember, I told you the autonomic nervous system is broken down into peripheral and good grief, broken down the peripheral and the autonomic into peripheral and sympathetic and parasympathetic. Okay, couldn't get it out. So, and I always said, you can always remember this. P.S. I love you. P.S. Parasympathetic and sympathetic. Autonomics. Okay, let's look at the sympathetic division first. The sympathetic division. Remember, the sympathetic division is going to put you in the fight or flight. And in that fight or flight, you're going to release adrenaline from the medulla of your adrenal glands. You're also going to release some adrenaline from the nerve endings throughout the body. So there's going to be a secretion of adrenaline. In the hospital, we call that epinephrine. Your pupils are going to dilate in the sympathetic response so that you can see things around you just a little bit better. Remember, you may be running for your life or fighting for your life, and your vision has to be as acute as it can be. Your cardiac rate will increase, so you'll have more contractions, and the contractions will have a greater force. You'll increase blood pressure because the smooth muscles in your arteries will contract. Whenever you narrow the lumen, you speed up the blood pressure because you've got to get blood to those muscles, and the blood going to the muscles delivers the oxygen for aerobic glycolysis, which gives energy to ATP. You've got to have energy in the fight or flight. You dilate, you open up the bronchial tubes so that you can get more air into the lungs and oxygen to the blood in the capillary nets in the lungs to pick up that oxygen to take it to the rest of the body. And you're going to increase that metabolism, anaerobic and aerobic glycolysis. So you're fighting for your life in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, now comes the fun. If you look, okay. If you look on page 433, you're going to see a transverse section through the spinal cord. Page 433, figure 11.36. I'm going to hold it up. Okay. Now, I'm not talking about the reflex arc. I'm talking about what happens in the sympathetic response. Now, there's the dorsal root ganglion. The dorsal root ganglion, as you know, is vital in the reflex arc, and it's vital in what you feel because it's purely sensory. But what happens in the sympathetic response is that you stimulate what we call paravertebral ganglia. We also call them lateral ganglia. and the sympathetic chain. This is a chain of ganglia alongside the outside of the spinal cord. It's not the dorsal root ganglia. It's a line of ganglia outside the cord. Of course, it's on both sides outside that cord. And we have three names for all of those ganglia. And what could they look like? Here is the cord. If you can see it, that doesn't show up on that. Maybe if I use a black marker. Okay, there's the cord. Alongside the cord, now I'm not going to draw in the dorsal root ganglia, but you assume it's there. But alongside that cord, in the thoracolumbar region, the thoracolumbar, that's the thorax with the lumbar region, you have what we call a lateral chain of ganglia. And this lateral chain of ganglia in the thorax with the lumbar region has three names. We call these ganglia. We're not talking about the dorsal root. We call these the paravertebral ganglia because they're on the outside of the spinal cord. We call them the lateral ganglia because they're lateral on the side of the spinal cord. And we also can call them the sympathetic chain. Now, they're going to be innervated from the spinal cord, but this is not the dorsal root ganglia. It's going to come off the spinal cord like that. So it's going to go from the spinal cord to the sympathetic chain. And think of the sympathetic chain as lots of little brains in the peripheral nervous system. That's what you can think of when you think of ganglia. Of course, the decision-making brain is your cerebral cortex. But the autonomic brain will be your hypothalamus, which directs this. And then the impulses go to these lateral ganglia, sympathetic chain, or paravertebral ganglia. Now, from here, the impulse is going to go, they're not that big, but I draw things big. Okay, they're going to go from the sympathetic chain and they're going into another group of ganglia, and they're also on this side also. And these are called the collateral ganglia. Collateral ganglia. So you've got the sympathetic chain, the lateral ganglia, or the paravertebral ganglia, and from here the impulse is going to the collateral ganglia. From the collateral ganglia, the motor impulse is going to the various glands of the body and muscles of the body and stimulates them into action or stimulates them to slow down. Yes, things do slow down in the sympathetic chain. Things do slow down when you're in the fight or flight. In the fight or flight, it's going to slow down digestion. So that means your stomach and small and large intestines is not going to be churning. It's going to mean that the glands in your stomach and small intestines and somewhat in your large intestines aren't going to be secreting because you don't need to digest your croissant when you're running from a saber-toothed tiger, which probably happened to all of our ancestors. So it slows down digestion, but it speeds up everything else. The pupils dilate, the heart is sped up, it goes much, much faster, the blood pressure increases. All of that is going to be sped up to keep you in the fight or flight so that you can survive. That is the sympathetic response. And you can see that sympathetic chain demonstrated right there in figure 11.37. Now that sympathetic chain uh, is illustrated, and you do have an illustration in the collateral ganglia. They're just showing you that the collateral ganglia are the ones that are going to go eventually to the organs to put you in that sympathetic response. Okay. Now, one thing I want to mention to you too is these fibers coming off the spinal cord, before the fibers actually reach the paravertebral ganglia, we call them preganglionic fibers. You could also consider the fibers that are going into the collateral branch as preganglionic to the collateral ganglia and postganglionic to the paravertebral ganglia. So this would be preganglionic before it gets to the sympathetic chain. After that, it could be postganglionic, but preganglionic to the collateral, and behind the collateral before it reaches the organs that it's going to prepare for the fight or flight. That would be postganglionic. And you'll have to take a minute. I'm going to have to increase my air conditioner. It's getting hot. All right. It will turn on. My husband turns it way down because he's always freezing. Poor old man. Don't tell him I told you that. Okay. And I'm always turning it up. I want air. He wants heat. Okay. Now, turn to page 434, because I promised you that this diagram delivers, and it does so beautifully. If you look at 434, you can see the spinal cord and the brain, and see these little blue dots in the spinal cord, those blue dots. Those little blue dots are representing the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, so that they're there. Then when you, after the dorsal root ganglia, those nerves that are going to the sympathetic chain, you can call those preganglionic, and the ones that are behind the sympathetic chain going to the collateral, postganglionic. But look at that with me, okay? It's a beautiful diagram. You only see it on one side. All right, and just imagine it's the same on the other side. If you look at this, all of those sympathetic ganglia, paravertebral ganglia, lateral ganglia, all those ganglia that are on the outside of the cord, remember they act as little brains or little pit stops. When you see a car race and they're racing around and all of a sudden steam comes from the engine, whatever, they pull over into what they call it, a pit stop. Those guys work real fast to get that car back on. Think of all these, the sympathetic chain of these lateral ganglia as pit stops or little brains. They're going to figure out what's going on to keep you in the sympathetic response. Then from there, you see all the fibers that are leading to the collateral ganglia. Now, in some of this is in the thoracolumbar region, some of these are going straight to the organs and not going through the collateral chain. You can see some of these are going to the eye, and of course you know that the eye's pupils are going to dilate. Some of these are going to your submandibular and your sublingual glands, these and the parotids. These are salivary glands. Now, salivary glands are important in the digestive system, but you don't need any innervation to the salivary glands because you're slowing down digestion Remember, you speed up some things, you slow down others. So the mouth can go dry in the sympathetic response. Look at the heart. The heart's going to be sped up. So there's a straight shot from the sympathetic chain to the heart. The heart's going to contract with a vengeance and move bum 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 like you feel when you're getting ready for an anatomy exam. Then to the lungs. The lungs are going to increase in respirations. You're going to breathe deeper and faster to oxygenate the blood in the lungs so that it can get to the muscles for more oxygen for aerobic glycolysis and making energy. Then when you go down and you see the innervation to the liver, the stomach, the pancreas, the small intestines, the large intestines, okay, the kidney, the urinary bladder, the female reproductive organs, and the male reproductive organs. That message from the sympathetic chain is going to go through the collateral ganglia to these organs. All of that, which is digestion and elimination that you see right here, all of that from these collateral ganglia. Those collateral ganglia, they're going to slow down all that activity because you don't need blood going to your digestive system or your elimination, your kidneys and your bowels. You don't need blood going to that area because you need to send the blood that you have straight to the muscles where you need that response. Now, this is what we call the all of these, the paravertebral ganglia and the collateral. I want to make that real clear to you because when I first heard this, I really thought that the sympathetic chain or the collateral or the lateral chain, I thought that was the dorsal root ganglia. And it was not. And I don't want you not to understand that. So everything's going to go to your body that needs to go in the fight or flight. Everything that you don't need to be doing in the fight or flight is going to be slowed down. Okay. And reproduction, when you're running from a mugger in Central Park or you're trying to protect your life, then the male, he's not going to get an erection when he's running from a mugger in Central Park or fighting for his life, okay? All of that's going to slow down. He's going to increase respirations, increase heart rate, increase blood pressure. Now, on the next page, page 435, it's going to show you the parasympathetic response. Now, there are ganglia in the parasympathetic response, but the ganglia in the parasympathetic response are going to come off the brain stem, and you see all of those nerves emanating from the brain stem and the sacral region of the spinal cord, way down low. So it's craniosacral. Those nerves coming off the brain stem and from the sacral region, they're going to go to all of those organs that you're looking at. And in the parasympathetic or the relaxed mode, it's going to be speeding things up that you need to happen when you're relaxed and slowing things down that you don't need to happen when you're relaxed. Okay, so let's look at this. Another thing I want you to look at, besides realizing that the parasympathetics come off the craniosacral and the sympathetics from the thoracolumbar region, those nerves, keeping that in mind, there are ganglia, but the ganglia in the parasympathetic response, they're either outside the organ as a ganglia or they're just inside that organ as a ganglia. And what do we call them? Terminal ganglia. Terminal, because they're terminating right there at the organ. So you have a straight shot to the organ, and you'll have terminal ganglia in the cranial region, and then you'll have the ganglia just inside the organ, the terminal ganglia, just inside the organ. And the artist has illustrated that. If you look at the cranial area, the blue represents nerves that are going to your eyes and your salivary glands, so that you can begin the relaxed mode. The pupils in the relaxed mode will constrict. Okay. The parotid glands and the submandibular and the sublingual glands, these are all salivary glands. They'll start secreting. So you'll start making saliva. You're going to get dry mouth in the sympathetic response, but you're going to secrete saliva in the parasympathetic response. Remember, they always say rest and digest. So that's sped up. Now, and those are ganglia that are terminal and they're outside the structure. Then from there on, and this is primarily cranial nerve X, as you can see, and that's the vagus nerve. It's a long nerve, 75% of which is parasympathetic. So look at that long cranial nerve. Number 10, the vagus nerve. It's going to the heart. It's going to the lungs. It's going to the trachea. It's got innervation to the liver and to the stomach, the gallbladder, the spleen, the small and large intestines, the kidneys, the urinary bladder, the female and male reproductive system. So what is it going to do to all of that? Well, it's going to speed up and slow down. Now, we mentioned in the sympathetic response that some things were slowed down and others were sped up. I remember when I first heard this, I thought, oh, the sympathetic means everything's sped up. Sympathetic S, no. In each response, some organs are in high duty, moving very, very fast, and others are slowed down in both sympathetic and parasympathetic. So in the parasympathetic, your pupils dilate, you salivate. Look at the innervation from the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, in this, it will slow down the heart. You don't need that heart beating 120 times a minute. You'll get back down to 70 or 60. So the vagus nerve will slow down the heart. It will regulate the respiratory system. It'll slow down your breathing. It will increase the activity of your liver because your liver is important to secrete bile in the digestive process. So you see the blue innervation, the blue lines, which are nerves going into the liver. And just inside that liver, those dots represent the terminal ganglia. So it speeds up the production of bile. The stomach will release more gastric juices. The pancreas will dump pancreatic juices into the duodenum, the first part of the small intestines. The small intestines will contract and expand, and digestive juices will be released. And the large intestines will contract and relax, so that the individual can have a bowel movement. The kidneys will work again, and urine will then flood into the bladder. And reproduction. The female reproductive system is activated in the parasympathetic response. The male in the parasympathetic response can get an erection. In the sympathetic, he could not, but in the parasympathetic, he can. So think of the parasympathetic as rest and digest. Rest and digest. And it makes it a little easier. Make sure you understand the difference between the terminal ganglia of the parasympathetic response and the collateral ganglia and the sympathetic chain in the sympathetic response, and the significance of the dorsal root ganglia, which are important in the reflex arc, that autonomic response to a given stimulus, and they're also responsible for taking everything in from your skin, your body, your muscles, going towards the spinal cord, and it's going to go into that sensory dorsal root ganglia, and then will be transferred up the ascending tracts to the brain. So I want all of that to be really, really clear. Now, I'm going to stop there. I am going to announce that I think I'll send you, I want you to start looking over the answers and or the questions in the study guide for the nervous system. Start looking over those. And I'm going to take significant terminologies from those questions, and I'll send you a vocabulary list of what I want you to really focus on. Now, this lecture, I'm going to 11 and 12, I'm going to quiz you on when we begin and discuss lecture 13. Now, if you understand what happens to the body in the sympathetic response, then you're going to also understand what happens in the parasympathetic response that is mentioned on page 29 and on page 30, parasympathetic division. Now, I'm going to let you do lecture 12 as a self-study guide. You got to study it because you're going to get questions. And it'll introduce the senses. We're going to leave the spinal cord and we're going to go into the special senses. And some of them we've already mentioned. I want you to read the significance of the receptors and the importance of chemoreceptors and pain receptors, thermoreceptors, proprioceptors, photoreceptors, and the special senses of the sense of smell, olfaction. So that is a self-study, lecture 12. So we've now done 11 or 12 hours of neurology, and I will email you some information about today and I'll prepare for lecture 13. Remember, 11 and 12, to know it well, because I'm going to ask questions on 13. And I will email you. Y'all have a good evening, the rest of the evening, and I'll end the stream. Have a good one. I sure do miss you guys.